and welcome to Cheers to Fears, where we review horror movies and turn them into drinking games. We're your two hosts. I'm Alex.
And I'm Tucker. Today we will be making a drinking game for Ouija, Origin of Evil, directed by Mike Flanagan, who has also directed Dr. Sleep, Midnight Mass, and Hush, just to name a few. The movie is written by Flanagan and Jeff Howard, who is also a writer for other movies Flanagan directed, such as Gerald's Game, Before I Wake, and Oculus.
Ouija, Origin of Evil takes place in the 1960s in the Xander house following Alice, the mother, and her two daughters, Lena and Doris. Alice is a fake psychic as she does readings to make ends meet as she is struggling with money since her husband passed away. Alice one night decides to include a Ouija board into her act, and the board immediately makes a connection to Doris, the younger daughter. Doris starts to make it known to her mother that she actually does possess psychic powers, so Doris starts to join her mother's act to help people communicate with their dead loved ones. As Doris starts to change, Lena, concerned for her sister, gets help from Father Tom to figure out what is wrong with Doris.
Just a fair warning, there are spoilers ahead, so if you have not watched the movie, feel free to pause the video and watch the movie now with our drinking rules posted on screen. We also recommend that you watch the first movie beforehand, even though it is, by comparison, a much worse film. And you also probably won't miss much, considering this is a prequel. But if spoilers are not an issue for you, or you've already seen the movie, then let's continue on to the rules.
The first rule in this movie, as always, is death. You take a sip when somebody dies. This came to a total of 7 in this film.
Yeah, and some of them are off screen. Like we counted their father because it was mentioned quite often, or even Father Tom's wife. We don't see her death, but we know she died. So we do count a couple off-screen deaths, and even the ones we do see, they're not too bloody. Maybe the death of the boyfriend, you could say, but other than that, it's not a whole lot of blood or gore involved.
Pretty tame, especially for a movie. I mean, the first one I'd say was more related to a teen slasher experience, and this one, it's less gory but done a lot better.
Oh yeah. Let's move on to rule number 2, which as always is screams, cries, and yells. Whenever you hear one, you take a sip, and this happens 21 times in the movie.
See? Yeah, there's no spirit. There's no spirit. Ellie!
Yep, this is about the average that we get for generally screams, cries, and yells.
Yep.
Nothing too much to say, so let's move on to the next rule, which is whenever the dead father is mentioned, and this came to a total of 9 sips.
And the reason it's important to the plot is because it allowed for character development between the mother and daughters. Like, it helped them, form a bond and a similarity or, a connection over a similar thing, being the loss of a loved one. So it helped, with their dynamic as a family. And in doing so, it kind of helps show how Doris barely comprehends death, doesn't really understand what's going on with death, or, she just doesn't know much about it. And then it also shows Lena having to help her mom because her mom's super stressed out and, she can't just go sneaking out and stuff. So moving on to rule number 4, it's whenever a reading is performed. And this happened 12 times in the movie.
Yep, we'd like to call it seance, but Alice insisted that they were called readings, so that's what we went with, I guess.
Is that where you do the seances?
Readings. Come on in.
This means whenever there's an Ouija board or any sort of thing like in the beginning of the movie where they're faking all the candles and whatnot, blowing them out. Furthermore, it could also be readings such as Alice reading the boyfriend's palm. I forgot what his name is, but that's another example.
Either. Yeah.
Moving on to our next rule is whenever supernatural things happen to Doris. If you see any of these, you take a sip, and this came to a total of 12 in this instance.
Yeah, and this kind of starts happening once we learn that she's a psychic. We see her talking with the spirits, walking on walls, all that stuff. So take a drink whenever any of that happens. But anyways, we'll move on to the next rule, which is whenever a rule is broken for a Ouija board, you take a sip, and this happens 10 times.
The rules. Never play alone. Never play in a graveyard. Always say goodbye.
These people are stupid for not following these rules, considering
almost never.
They almost never follow them.
They almost never say goodbye.
I think they might. No, I don't think they do.
I don't even remember them saying goodbye. To be honest.
I don't. Anyways, so yeah, it's revealed at the end of the movie that they were playing on a graveyard the whole time.
They're in here. All of them.
We played in a graveyard.
But that's just one sip because we don't like to think preemptively, especially if we haven't seen the movies.
Yeah, exactly.
Or for the audience members that haven't either.
Yeah, well, exactly. We want it to be simple. We don't want we don't want things ruined in the movie based on our rules. So
Yeah, we don't want you to take drinks in advance.
Exactly.
Moving on to the next rule is whenever you see white eyes, you take a sip. And this came to a total of 14 sips.
Yeah, and we talked about in our first episode how it was done much better in this movie than the first one. Like, especially with, like, the way Doris was looking was quite scary and, had a little bit more of a threatening look, I guess. And I do want to clarify that we kept this as a separate rule from something supernatural happening to Doris. You could argue that, the eyes being all white is supernatural. But since it's a different rule, we didn't want to have to double up for it, so just keep that in mind. Now, moving on to rule number 8, it's whenever Father Tom does something to help uncover the truth of Doris. And this happens 6 times in the film.
Yeah, so this can be pretty much anything that Father Tom does to help, such as questioning the sister Lena, finding evidence. It's a pretty vague rule that can also be left up to interpretation, so you can take it with a grain of salt for sure. Definitely, whatever you feel is appropriate to take a sip for it, go for it.
Yeah, you might end up taking more than what we counted, but like we said, it's up to your interpretation.
Yeah, you might also end up taking less too.
Exactly.
Moving on to the next rule is whenever somebody is whispering, you take a sip, and this came to a total of 6.
Yeah, not much to say about this rule. I mean, we should say that it's somebody whispering to somebody else, like whispering in their ear, but it doesn't happen all that much, but it's pretty obvious when it happens, so nothing else to say on that. So we'll move on to the final rule of this drinking game, which is whenever you see a Ouija board, and this happens 11 times in the movie.
Yes, we felt the need to include this rule, such as we did for the last one. I feel like it's kind of explanatory. Movies called the Ouija, gotta have a sip for whenever you see a Ouija board.
Yeah, it just makes sense.
And that does it for all the rules that we have today. The total number of sips that we got today is 108. This is the equivalent of drinking 3.5 drinks based off a 30 sip per can scale per 12 ounce can.
Yeah, so drinking in the movie was not too hard. It was decent, middle of the road, average amount of drinks, I'd say. The first movie did have 101 sips, which this one had, 5, 6, 7 more than this last one. But it's pretty much the same, to be honest, in terms of how much you're drinking.
And I feel like one of the main things that made this drinking game a little bit worse or better, it gave it more sips anyways, is just Doris being one of the primary characters, getting a lot of screen time and causing a lot of sips for us.
Yeah. A lot of our drinking rules did revolve around her, or, she was having a part in them, so she did give us a lot of drinks for sure.
Yeah. So Mike Flanagan had 3 movies released in 2016. This movie, Hush, and Before I Wake. All 3, in my opinion, are pretty solid.
Yeah, I honestly haven't seen Before I Wake, but I do really enjoy Hush for sure. This movie was also really good, especially compared to the first one. And I guess that's what we should start off talking about is how was it better than the first one?
How was it worse? It wasn't. It worse in like almost any way.
Everything was better about it, but I guess we'll start with the character development. For just an example, we see Tom connecting with the family a lot more. Like, we see him connecting with Alice about losing a loved one, and we see him connecting to both of the daughters about losing their father. So, we see these character dynamics and relationships forming throughout the movie and getting stronger and, learning about them as characters through it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's safe to say the characters in this movie were not at all one-dimensional as they were in the first installment.
Yeah.
In this installment, you got backstory, even, who was it? Mikey, I guess is the boyfriend's name. He had a little bit of not really backstory, but you liked him a little bit. He was just trying to woo Lena. Is that her name?
Yeah.
Lena. I keep forgetting, yet I remember the name Mikey. But yeah, I didn't have a problem with him. He was, for the most part, there to be killed off.
Yeah.
Even though he was, for the most part, memorable.
Well, I mean, he was at least better than pretty much every character in the first one, despite him only being there for the kill.
Exactly.
But yeah, it just goes to show how little character development they had in the first one. And then we also see even more character development with the mother and the daughters because, she's a single mother trying to raise the daughters and, it's tough on both of them, everybody in the family. I guess 3 of them, not just 2. But yeah, it's tough on all of them and, it helps build character and gives us a little bit more to empathize with them and understand their point of view.
Yeah. One of the major things that happened in this movie that was somehow stronger in this movie than the last one is the jump scares. Considering that this movie had a lot more about character development as opposed to jump scares.
Yeah.
And the first movie is just like, oh, door opens, or like, oh, somebody's behind me, that's my friend.
Yeah.
And this movie, like, jump cuts to doors with, like, the wide eyes, open mouth, and like, oh, wow, what's that face?
Yeah.
It, like, spooks you for a little bit. But it's not, like, a cheap gimmick.
No, they don't overuse it or just rely too heavily on it.
Mm-hmm. I guess back more on the movie itself for the story, the background of Marcus, in my opinion, felt a little bit weird. It felt a little bit out of place comparison to the first movie where Doris was the evil entity. And continuing on from that, like, how does she kill people? All that. Does she use the doctor? Does the doctor use Doris's body? Is Doris actually evil? Does she still control Doris after death, even though, like, you saw her moving on to the afterlife?
Yeah.
So maybe it's just assumed that the demon or Marcus or somebody controls her body. So that led to a few more plot holes, but we're not really holding it against the movie because the first movie sucked.
Yeah,
So
and
we
they
don't-
did have to try and tie it in with the first one still. Even though it's a prequel, but they still had to try and tie it
Yeah,
together.
they didn't do that too well, but honestly, we don't care.
Yeah, it
we,
should
we
have been
care
a
as much
standalone.
as we care about as much as we did care about the first movie, which we didn't care about the first movie at all.
Yeah. I guess one last thing to say about the movie is I just want to point out about Doris running on the ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
It was both scary and hilarious at the same time because, you know, we got to see her pretty, like, she was pretty creepy throughout the film, and, you know, we got to see her face changing and warping and, you know, her eyes turning all white and stuff, and I don't know, just seeing that scene, it made me laugh out loud, but at the same time, I could picture myself being in that situation and being scared as hell.
Oh yeah.
So, like, I don't know, it was kind of weird feeling, but also, like, I don't know, it worked in a way.
Yeah, it's I guess the same thing with the monologue towards Mikey, the whole strangling thing. It's funny but scary.
Yeah.
So Tucker, what are your overall thoughts on Ouija: Origin of Evil?
I mean, it goes without saying, this one is a huge improvement over the first one. Honestly, if I had watched this without watching the first one, it would have been a hell of a lot better, but I also don't know if I would have thought it was so good. I don't know. I think the first one made my expectations so low for this one that it made me enjoy it that much more.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
But the first one's almost unwatchable. It's super boring and just one-dimensional, you know, stereotypical cliches all over the place. But this one, at least, you get some character development. You know, the acting's done well. Even the jump scares are done better and not relied on so heavily. You know, there's just a lot more going for this film than the first one.
Yeah, and from my understanding, when was the first time you watched the first Ouija movie?
First time I watched it?
Yeah.
I don't even know the first time I watched it.
And when was the first time you watched the Origin of Evil?
Yesterday.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So Ouija: Origin of Evil, like, it probably turned so many people off, the first film anyways, turned so many people off of watching the second one.
Oh yeah.
And I remember I went to theaters for the second one, and I don't know why, because the first one sucked. I went to theaters and like, what? This movie was good, huh? It was just like a pleasant surprise.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I went to the first one, or the second one, but I'm very glad that I did get that theater experience.
Yeah, and I mean, I wasn't going out of my way to not watch this one because I had heard that it's so much better than the first one
yeah.
all these years. But I just didn't care to go and watch it because, I don't know, I just thought it was going to be the typical ghost story again, haunted house story. But yeah, it was a little bit, it was more than that and done well. So I'm glad I did finally get around to watching it.
Yeah.
So even though the characters were a lot better in this film, there were still dumb decisions made, which leads us to our award ceremony, where we award one not-so-lucky nominee, the Darwin Award. This award goes out to the character who made a stupid decision that resulted in them getting killed, somebody else getting killed, or simply resulting in something bad happening that could have easily been avoided. This award can also be given to a character who is just plain dumb. Here are the nominees.
Today's first nominee is Mikey for following Doris into the basement despite the likelihood of him being murdered in the basement is fairly high.
Second is Alice, for not recognizing the change in Doris, along with using the Ouija board and breaking many of its rules.
The last nominee is Lena, for insisting that she does not split up with her mother and Father Tom. This is probably the only time in a horror movie somebody should split up from the pack, as outside of the house is probably the safest spot to be.
And the winner is Mike. It was a close call, but at the end of the day, going into that basement alone with Doris is just asking to be killed.
And with all that being said, we hope you enjoyed our look into a Ouija Origin of Evil. If you ended up playing the game alongside the movie, or if you have any other feedback or suggestions, let us know in the comments below. Also let us know in the comments what your favorite Mike Flanagan film is.
If you want to check out our most recent video on Ouija, click on the box on the top right. Or if you want to see a playlist of all the drinking games and movies we review, click on the box below it. Thanks for tuning in, and this is us saying cheers to fears.